So, James, I want to talk to you about the cult dynamics of wokeness or wokeism. I've been laying out for the audience this week that we don't have a problem with not enough religion. We have too much religion. What we're seeing with environmentalism and wokeness and CRT and race, everything, that is a religion. And it's become a cult. Can you explain how because you've done serious work comparing CRT and gender and everything else to cult behavior. So take the process and break it up for us. How do these people become members of this cult? How has this happened to half our country?
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing people need to understand is you're spot on. So that's good to hear. It is a religion. Marxism is a religion. If you want a kind of nutshell for especially Christians in the audience, where the Gospel of John says that, the Logos is the Christ, that the Word became flesh. Their religion is a religion of pathos, of emotion, of feeling, of fear, as a matter of fact. And so they have a religion of pathos. They've created a cult around it. It's the largest cult startup in human history because they've been able to propagandize so effectively for it. And the way you get people into a cult is by manipulating their vulnerability. It's a very simple process. You make them feel vulnerable about something, and then you give them the resolution to that vulnerability through the doctrine. One of the things, and you're going to probably be surprised since we're talking about Marxism, that I'm going to bring up here is you can tell people, for example, there's a very dangerous virus. This virus is incredibly dangerous, but if you just start wearing a mask, then you're going to be safer. So you give them a lot of concern, a lot of vulnerability, you make them afraid, and then you tell them something they can do, and then that will help them protect themselves. And then you tell them, oh no, it's much worse than we thought. You have to stay home. Oh no, it's much worse than we thought. You have to get this vaccine. And just step after step after step, you ratchet up the vulnerability, then you give them something in line with the doctrine that they can do to commit to, and that if they do it, and if everybody else does it too, then we're going to be okay. And that manipulation of vulnerability is exactly how you induce somebody into a cult. And if you want to mass induce a cult, you can see what we did on the media over the last 2 to 3 years.
So why is it, though, that the left is susceptible to this, and I guess the right is in its own, we have our own cult-like kind of things, but when we're talking about, let's say, just the masks, it only worked on half the country. At least it's only still working on half the country. Well,
there's been this very long-running program that I still think that this is kind of the master key to everything. I've studied communism now for a number of years, and you hear this again and again, whether it's Mao Zedong, whether it's Lenin, it doesn't matter. The right-wing people, the right-wing people, the right-wing people, that's the problem. And we've been laying tracks for 40 years that whatever the political right wants to do is either evil or dumb or uninformed or propaganda. And so conservatives equals bad is actually the big cult. Right wing equals bad is the big cult. And so it's very effective to get people to fall into, this is called social identity theory in social psychology, to get people to fall into two tribes or multiple tribes that are kind of against one another. We've been laying tracks. I often like to blame Jon Stewart directly for this from The Daily Show, as a matter of fact, to make it out that conservatives are always dumb, always bad-intentioned, always bad people. So you find otherwise smart and intelligent people who identify as left liberals who, in utter fear of being identified as a conservative, will go along with whatever the establishment says. They also just aren't skeptical of that yet. CNN is TV, it's news. They're not skeptical yet. So when they come on and say, here's this thing, it's very scary, they get panicked, and then they get drawn in through that pathos to doing what they're being instructed to do to resolve that feeling of discomfort.
Okay, so the first step is you find something that connects with people emotionally. You show them, wow, we're really vulnerable. This is really bad. But if you just do this, and then you just keep moving them down the road, more and more demanding and insidious traits of the cult, and they just are kind of a frog boiled slowly. The second step is indoctrination, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, for example, to switch examples out of the virus and into racism, or the critical race theory, you tell somebody, did you know these little things that you're doing in your life are racist? And they feel vulnerable. They start getting pulled in. And you give them, at some point, a lot of material to read, not just something they can do about, you can do better, but now you need to read this book by Robin DiAngelo that explains racism and white fragility. You need to read this book by Ibram Kendi that tells you how to be an anti-racist. You need to start going to these meetings at work, these DEI meetings, and listening to what they have to say. And you just start hammering the cult doctrine over and over and over again, while in the background you're still running this vulnerability cycling. And then you can really get people to just get sucked into the worldview, as a matter of fact, that the cult has decided to occupy. And so that phase is an indoctrination phase. You're still using the vulnerability to get them pulled in deeper and deeper, and at this point to separate them from people who would disagree with them. But you're also going to start asking them to read large amounts of cult literature or exposing them to large amounts of cult information one way or another.
Let me push back just a little bit and see if you can, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, but there was a problem in the Jefferson administration, and the problem was the war in Libya against the Barbary pirates. And he wanted to explain that this was crazy and very, very dangerous what was going on. And so he wanted the Quran published in its entirety, not clips. And so they published the Quran here in the United States in English. And he said, you have to read this because this is a threat and they won't stop. We might stop them this time, but they will continue to come at us until God says enough or we destroy it. Why is that not a cult? Giving you lots to read?
I spend my entire day, most of the time, reading Marxism of some form or another, and Marxism is a gigantic cult. And so it's possible to study a cult doctrine without being pulled into the vulnerability cycling. If the woke call me racist at this point, it doesn't make me feel vulnerable. I think that I must have said or done something right. And so actually it adds confidence. But I want to understand. So reading through the materials of a cult so that you can understand how the cult thinks is not necessarily the same thing as being pulled into it and made to conform to it on pain of excommunication and verbal abuse, etc.
So the difference here is that Jefferson made people fear. They were like, okay, this is a real problem. Here's what you need to do. You need to understand it. But then there was no indoctrination, no making you feel like a bad person. You have to have those other things, correct?
Yeah, I mean, did Jefferson get the Quran published and then tell you you're not a real American and you have to leave if you don't read it? No, of course he didn't. He left the liberty side open.
Correct.
Whereas, if you start getting pulled into the critical race theory cult, they tell you need to read Robin DiAngelo and you refuse to do it, or Ibram Kendi and you refuse to do it. Well, that's just you trying to protect your racism. That's just you trying to protect your access to whiteness. That's just you trying to keep the status quo or your own benefit from it. And so they pull that. There's that. You see, that's that emotional vulnerability thing that they start ripping on you again. The second you don't comply. Now, if we go back to the masks, you don't wear a mask, you want to kill grandma. We're never going to get out of the pandemic if you don't wear your mask. You're hurting everybody. And that's the difference between a cult and giving people information about something that's going on and letting them choose to study it or not.
And it is also the reason why they say the conversation is over, the discussion is up, the science is settled, the earth is going to be destroyed. And if you don't agree, you just want everybody to die a horrible death.
Yeah, and you're just selfish and want to ride out your last few years with your pickup truck or whatever, having a good time, not caring about everybody else. That's the emotional manipulation that they're using to bring people into that doctrine. And then, like I said, they give you something to do every single time, which is going to involve reading a lot of literature to resolve your feelings of tension. Although these books actually will bring you even deeper into that, which then they can help facilitate how you need to be an anti-racist better, or you need to do your part better, or whatever it happens to be for the greater good.
Okay, so when we come back, I want you to talk about deprogramming, because that's the hard part. And this is where, and James, tell me if I'm wrong here. I think we've been approaching this with reason and with political arguments. And every time we get mad, every time we push back, that's what they expect us to do. And so they're prepared for that. They're not prepared for understanding and kindness with disagreement. And we keep making the problem worse by the tactics that we currently use, because we think it's a normal conversation, but it's not. It's a conversation with people who have already been brainwashed. Correct?
Yeah, that's more or less correct.
Okay, so tell me where I'm less correct when we come back, and so I make sure that I understand it clearly, and then show us how to deprogram people. Can you take us through deprogramming, and why don't we use gender theory as an in? Can you do that?
Yeah, we can give that a go. Deprogramming, by the way, is extremely hard. I don't want to give people false hope that we can just, you're going to listen to the program and go out and just talk to people, and they're going to suddenly realize that there are
Right.
just two genders and everything's great. Yeah, it turns out to be very difficult. Usually what you have, though, with people who are in a cult is that they have a very hermetically sealed, if you will, belief system. So there's an excuse for everything. You say this, they have some excuse for that. And if you want to get to the deprogramming, one of two things has to happen. Either you have to say something that gets them to kind of go cross-eyed for a second, where they don't have their hermetically sealed answer available, or something has to happen in their life that shakes them up a little bit and causes them to have that initial doubt. It all starts with an initial doubt in the doctrine, something they can't resolve. And then when one of those things happens, and this is where I said more or less correct, and you wanted me to explain how you're a little less correct. They're not totally hermetically sealed. So when somebody experiences doubt, they're also experiencing starvation for reality. They're very hungry for an explanation for what's going on around them. They may only be able to digest so much, but they're very, for example, many people who have voted Democrat their entire lives right now are noticing that the sexual grooming that's going on in the schools, and the cult grooming, which is by and large more than the sexual grooming that's happening, when they see that, they see something is off. They know that childhood innocence is something important, something to protect, that children should not be sexualized or dragged into these identities. And this identity confusion, as a matter of fact. And so then that's where you're going to find that break. And then that's when you can start to have an open and honest dialogue, because they're going to be starving for truth. They might not be ready to hear that the Marxists have run a sexualization of children program to overthrow society since the 1920s, when George Lukács did it in Hungary. They may not be ready for that.
I don't know if I'm ready for that, but God bless you for knowing it. So where do you start?
Well, I mean, you have to start where they are expressing confusion. When you hear somebody say, for example, and you will hear this very many times now, what's going on here? And then you tell people, well, where you can start with that, if it's with the gender, is to say that some very bizarre beliefs about gender have taken hold, and the people who have taken hold of them have decided that they have to be put into children as early as possible. And then, if you really want to throw a wedge in there, you can point out. They say, everybody believes it's to protect LGBT kids who don't have, maybe the support at home or whatever. But if you actually read their literature about it, which is why you do have to do like Jefferson said and go get informed, you'll see they say in their own words that queer theory, which is what is actually informing this, is not about creating a stable LGBTQ identity. It's in fact about creating a identity that stays fluid and never solidifies. And if that alarms you about a child or seems to open them up to grooming, then we can talk further.
James Lindsay, he is the founder of New Discourses. You can find this at newdiscourses.com, newdiscourses.com. And he's also the author of Race Marxism. Both I urge you to check out.